Welcome to episode 309 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Richard Denholm, who served in the FBI for 22 years. In this episode, Rich reviews the missing person investigation of Jessie Davis, the 9-month pregnant girlfriend of Canton, Ohio police officer Bobby Cutts Jr. Rich led this case as the supervisor of the Cleveland Division's Canton resident agency. The disappearance of Jessie Davis became a national news story. The Starks County Sheriff's Office invited the FBI to provide assistance with interviews of witnesses and subjects and the polygraph examination of Cutts, after which he agreed to show the agents where Davis's body was buried. Cutts was charged and convicted on 7 counts involving the homicide of Davis and her unborn child. Rich also talks about the connection this tragic case had with the investigation of the murder of another 9-month pregnant woman, Laci Peterson. Throughout Rich Denholm's FBI career, he led significant high-profile investigations, including public corruption, white-collar crime, and violent crime. Rich received the Attorney General's Award in 2003 for leading the investigation of a U.S. congressman. Rich served as the FBI's Deputy Director to the U.S. Department of Justice Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force Fusion Center and led the efforts of federal law enforcement to share intelligence across all agencies of the U.S. government. He is a certified FBI law enforcement instructor and has taught courses at all levels of federal, state, and local law enforcement. Since his retirement from the Bureau, Rich continues to be very busy. He is an adjunct faculty member at George Mason University in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. He is also a director at A1C Partners, delivering advisory services to federal government clients, and he has his own law practice, Denholm Law, PLLC. Rich is also the author of 2 textbooks, anthologies about corruption in the federal government and intelligence studies. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to remind you that I'm posting 3 episodes in a row in February. So make sure you follow FBI Retired Case File Review wherever you listen to podcasts so you won't miss any episodes. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Richard Denholm. Hey, Rich, how are you?
Hi, Jerry. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. We are going to be discussing a really fascinating case today that is a murder case that kind of plays out all over the country, all over the world when it comes to pregnant women being murdered by their baby's father.
Yes.
Why don't you set this up and tell us where you were assigned as an agent and how the FBI got involved in a murder case? Because unlike what people think, there are only certain situations where we're invited into a murder case or we have jurisdiction to primarily investigate a murder case. We'll talk more about your background at the end, but just tell us where you were in your career when this all started.
Yes, absolutely, Jerry. That's the thing, is it often comes down to whether the FBI will get involved or can get involved in one of these cases. At this time in 2007, I was the supervisory senior resident agent in charge of the Canton resident agency of the FBI's Cleveland Division. It's quite a mouthful, quite a lot to write. But it boiled down to I was the supervisor of the Canton office of the FBI, a satellite of Cleveland. Was the supervisor over about 10 FBI agents and support personnel. We had jurisdiction for federal crimes in 10 counties in the kind of central part of Ohio, about 35 miles south of Cleveland. I was in charge of all basically FBI violations that we could investigate. In this case, in particular, it is a murder case of a pregnant woman. She was 9 months pregnant. She was literally within days of giving birth to her child. And normally the FBI would not get involved in such a murder case. One way we could get involved in what happened here is that if a local department asks for the FBI's help, because the case is very complicated, it's just bigger than them, they don't have the manpower perhaps or the expertise. We call it domestic police cooperation in the FBI. And if they ask us for help, we oftentimes do help them and provide support. That kind of sets up where I was at the time, how we got into it.
Where do you want to start? Do you want to start at that point of the involvement? Or do you want to take us from the very beginning when somebody knew something was wrong?
I think it's a really interesting point as to where exactly I was when I first heard about a possible investigation involving her. And it does have overlap to prove your point with another major nationally reported investigation. Not only is this a very sad, tragic case, but I always found it to be very interesting because, as I said, in my position as the supervisor in charge of the Canton office, I had to liaison with all the local law enforcement in that 10-county jurisdiction, both the sheriff's departments and the local police departments. What is really odd with this and how I found out about it, back up a couple days before I first heard about the disappearance of Jessie Davis, I was invited to attend what they call the Buckeye State Sheriff's Association meeting, which occurs once a year. And this was in June of 2007. And in my position as supervisor, I was invited to attend this. And all the sheriffs from Ohio's over 80 counties get together and talk about law enforcement issues, overlapping cases, and how we can work together and communicate better. So I had gone down there for this event, and kind of unbelievably, the guest speaker at this event was the chief of police of the Modesto, California Police Department. And he spent quite a bit of time as the keynote speaker talking about his role in the investigation, the disappearance of a 9-month pregnant woman named Laci Peterson. And they had a huge investigation that was nationally televised, essentially. It was on the news pretty much every night. It was a huge event as they were looking for this missing woman. Her husband, Scott Peterson, came under suspicion. There were images of him helping searchers look for her, and he was having crying fits and breaking down and being so upset that she had disappeared. The long story short is her body eventually washed up on shore, and they determined that she had been murdered, and they indicted her husband, Scott Peterson. That also was nationally televised over many days and weeks. And he was eventually convicted of her murder and sent to prison. At this Buckeye State Sheriff's Association meeting, the Modesto chief of police was talking to all of us as senior leaders in law enforcement about how to deal with the media for these types of national events. And I remember sitting there, typical of us in the FBI, we end up in a lot of cases. And I was thinking, well, it's probably never going to happen to me. I'm never going to see anything like this. But it's good to know. It's good professional development. And I learned a few tips from it.
I do recall that the FBI did work with the police on the Laci Peterson case. I believe that the FBI's dive team was involved in looking for her body.
I believe they were. And I think that fits exactly with the idea of how the FBI's jurisdiction could be used and cross over, where we could provide that technical assistance to a local department. So all of these things were in my mind as I drove the couple hours back from the Columbus, Ohio area back to my office in Canton. And just kind of thinking about it, remembering the story about Laci Peterson and thinking how tragic it was. Literally, as I drove into Canton, and you cannot make this stuff up, as we always said in the FBI, one of the agents who worked with me in my office, a super agent, handled everything just professionally, was just one of the best agents. He called me and he said, hey, I'm getting called by the Stark County Sheriff's Department because there's this woman, Jessie Davis, who's been reported missing. It's starting to develop kind of a lot of media interest and just a lot of interest from departments around the area. And she was 9 months pregnant and she's missing. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I'm like, you don't know what I just heard, do you? He's like, no, what are you talking about? And so I told him about the Modesto chief. This is like the exact same thing. I'm like, you just cannot make this up. So he said to me, should we get involved? Should I go help? And I said, well, yeah, you can go over to the Stark County Sheriff's Office, see if they need us or if they want our help. And we're standing by. We'll help them if they need it. So he said, fine. So he went there. I get back to my office. He calls me a little bit later. He's like, they don't really need our help right now. And I said, well, that's fine. I go, we got plenty to do. There's enough federal crimes going on, and we have a lot of huge cases, a lot of huge drug cases going on. But okay, we'll monitor it and see if they need help. So the agent and I agreed that's kind of what we do. However, it didn't last that long. I remember later that day, I believe it was later that day, the agent called me back and said, yeah, no, the sheriff's department needs our help. They want us involved in this and they're asking our help. So at that point, I'm like, I don't know what our jurisdiction would be. We literally talked about, because she was so pregnant, the FBI obviously has jurisdiction over kidnapping matters of children, mostly. We said, I don't know if we have jurisdiction. Can we even call it a kidnapping? Can we do that with a straight face? So I called my superiors. I reported to an assistant special agent in charge in Cleveland. Ran it by him. He ran it by the boss of the office. We would call a special agent in charge of the Cleveland field office. It was decided, yeah, we could go ahead and talk to Stark County, see how we could help. That's kind of where we were at. So at that point, I literally drive over to the Stark County Sheriff's Office, not quite knowing what I was walking into. And I clearly remember driving into the parking lot of that office, and all of the media trucks were already there. I was just in shock. I'm like, oh, wow, this is like already blown up way more than I had thought. The CNN trucks were there, Fox News, all those with the satellite dishes, et cetera. So they were already catching on to this. This is like a similar case to Laci Peterson, and they all wanted to be in on the action. At that point, I went into the Stark County Sheriff's Office, met with the sheriff and the sheriff's number 2 in charge, and we just kind of started talking about a plan about what was going on. I was essentially getting my first briefing when I walked into the sheriff's office. I didn't quite know all the facts. What I quickly learned was that Jessie Davis's mother had reported her missing. And that's a very important fact because, as you already kind of set it up, Jerry, there was perhaps a boyfriend or a husband or somebody else involved, and they did not report this. So that's always a red flag to us. A lot of times is common sense is when we do these investigations. If it doesn't look right and feel right, it's usually not right. In this case, Jessie Davis's mother had reported her missing because she had last talked to her about the day before while Jessie Davis was at a grocery store. And then Jessie's mom really didn't hear from her for several days. Jessie Davis's mother went over to Jessie's apartment looking for her, and she found her 2-year-old son by himself. And it's really heartbreaking. Her 2-year-old son was basically in a diaper all alone in this apartment.
Wow.
It's really sad. Yeah. And that was kind of heartbreaking to all of us. The mother goes in, finds the baby alone, and immediately notices that the house was in disarray. She could smell bleach. There was a heavy smell of bleach in the house, especially in one area.
Yeah, not a good sign.
Again, we as FBI agents think, who's trying to clean something up? It's probably not good. And there was broken furniture around the house. So obviously something bad had happened. Jessie's mother told us the son actually could talk a bit, very bright boy, and he kept saying, Mommy broke the table and Mommy's in the rug. Those were kind of the first clues that we had. Now we really knew that something was up. I can get into it a bit later too, but obviously the 2-year-old heard things, saw things, but how in the world, Jerry, do you use that person as a witness in an affidavit or even at court? It makes it incredibly complicated. And also, we in the FBI very much care about victims and witnesses, and we work very hard to protect them. In fact, there's a whole division in the FBI for victim witnesses, and we have to be very careful to make sure that we take care of them. So at that point, we're starting to put out more and more press about Jessie and that she's missing. And this started to attract literally thousands of volunteers to come to the area to search for her. And again, I was very struck with the overlap to what I had heard from the chief of police of Modesto. One of the searchers that the reporters kept keying on in their video was Bobby Cutts. Bobby Cutts was a Canton, Ohio police officer, and he was the boyfriend of Jessie Davis. He was the father of the boy who was found in the apartment, and we also believed he was the father of Jessie's unborn child. And Bobby Cutts was out with the searchers, and they kept showing him breaking down in tears, taking a knee, pouring water on his head, crying. He's just obviously distraught that Jessie was missing.
Did he live in the apartment with Jessie and his son?
See, this is what was still kind of confusing about their relationship. He was married at the time.
And not to her.
And he also had a number of other girlfriends. Oh. We also had found out that he liked to go on dating sites. Now, nothing against dating sites. They're fine. But I have found in my career just some odd activity when people are doing that, especially if they're going on to dating sites while they're allegedly looking for their missing girlfriend, which we found out Cutts was actually doing. Just really bizarre. But I am not clear, and I don't know if we ever really nailed that down, whether he lived there full time, but he was there quite a bit.
You had talked about receiving this training during a luncheon for sheriffs. Had the sheriff from this sheriff department attended that luncheon too? Or was he aware of what you had learned about the Laci Peterson case?
That's a great question. I don't think he was there. I don't think he or his number two were at this event, as I recall. My memory may be a little fuzzy, but I don't recall him being there. But I do remember when I showed up, I was talking to them about it was unbelievable with the overlap of Modesto. They benefited from our background knowledge of how to handle the press and answer questions and stuff during these.
That is just really such a coincidence. Could we talk a little bit more about all of the things that the FBI did to participate in this investigation? And also, in many states, the sheriff office, their duties are not investigative, they're more custodial. What's the situation in Ohio? Did they also need you because the sheriff department did not have the experience of investigating these type of cases?
A lot of these sheriff's departments do more than just custodial work in jails or serving process. Many of them actually do have investigators and have experience doing it. The sheriff's departments up here in Ohio will work with us on task forces, et cetera. So yes, also they don't have the investigative experience that we have. I think the other thing that was beyond them was the national media being there. These are jurisdictions in rural Ohio that don't have a ton of experience with the media. And they really needed our help with that. Our personnel deal with big cases all the time. Our senior leadership got involved. They were there in Canton a lot. Our media representative was helping with all the news conferences and also just to use those conferences to try to generate leads that would help us develop information about her whereabouts. That was kind of a big thing.
Do you recall the size of the sheriff's department?
It's a pretty big department, actually. I mean, Stark County, because it has Canton, obviously it has the Pro Football Hall of Fame there. They do handle events, but I don't know the exact number of their deputies or anything. But it's not like a small department. They have a bunch of people.
The agents were also helping with interviewing witnesses and the suspect. Did they do that in partnership with a deputy or a detective from the sheriff's department?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. Yeah. So our office in Canton was pretty much open 24/7 during this time. I clearly remember one of the senior leaders of the Stark County Sheriff's Department was in my office sitting there the whole time as we were coordinating leads. We had a meeting at one point. I remember our conference room. There were probably about 10 to 15 Stark County deputies in my office as we were coming up with a plan because we'll oftentimes just use brute force on these. We would search dumpsters in a whole area looking for anything that could relate to the murder, bloody clothes, towels covered in bleach, whatever it was. Deputies were actually in our office working with us every day. When we were really heavily involved, Cutts got a lawyer because almost always we're going to start looking at the family members around the person who was there most recently. The child didn't say how mommy got in the rug or how the furniture got broken, and I was always kind of struck by that. We had to start focusing on Cutts at some point. What's also interesting is the fact that there's some politics in this, that Cutts was a Canton, Ohio police officer. We in the FBI worked very closely, as we discussed, with the local police. I was actually good friends with the chief of police of Canton. We met all the time. We had some Canton, Ohio officers on our task force. It was sensitive because anytime you potentially are going to start looking at an officer, it kind of ramps it up a bit. There's extra sensitivities. We definitely don't want to be wrong if we're going to accuse a police officer of doing something. And early on, obviously, we didn't know, other than the fact that there's often this overlap between the spouse or the boyfriend or whatever when these events occur. But we needed a lot more than that. We needed evidence. Remember, the Canton, Ohio Police Department is a very large police department. It's a pretty big city in Ohio, and they were not working with us at all. I understood that because it was a very difficult time when one of your officers is coming under scrutiny. But this very much was a FBI and Stark County Sheriff's Office joint effort. But yeah, they were out there. They were in on every decision with us, etc. There actually is one more story overlap as we were doing this as well. At one point, this was a day or two into it, We had secured the apartment. We wanted it to stay just as it was. And I remember very clearly it was very late at night, and I actually had gone home for the first time in a while. And I get a call from the special agent in charge of the office. And he says, "What's going on with the crime scene right now?" And I'm like, "I don't know why." He said, "Well, I'm watching CNN and Greta Van Susteren is broadcasting live from inside the crime scene." I was like, "Oh, you've got to be kidding."
What?
Yeah. Yeah. So what had happened was Stark County was doing the security for the crime scene for us. That was one of the major efforts and a huge help because they had manpower to do this. And somebody had let her in so she could show the furniture knocked over and report from inside there. I was on the phone right away to the Stark County Sheriff's Office and not so gently said, "That needs to be shut down immediately." So they did. They got her out of there. And that ended her news coverage from inside the crime scene. So again, just one of those wacky things that can happen in a fast-paced investigation, and everybody was getting tired. I still to this day, I don't know how that occurred, but it did.
In addition to interviewing the witnesses, you had mentioned that the suspect, Bobby Cutts, had lawyered up. Did you have any opportunity to interact with him,
With the lawyer or Bobby Cutts?
with Bobby?
Yeah. So again, that's oftentimes the technical expertise that the FBI can bring to bear. We have polygraphers in the FBI, and they are very adept at doing interviews and testing witness statements and being able to give us some indication whether someone's being truthful or not. They actually allowed Bobby Cutts to do a polygraph. Sometimes defendants will want to do that out of bravado or just out of a sense of they're going to get away with this. They know how to beat a polygraph and maybe it'll exonerate them and get the spotlight off of them. But the results of that polygraph were, if I remember correctly, were inconclusive. That wasn't all that important at that point, actually, because we already were getting technical information that his story didn't match up, that he was elsewhere north of Canton when he said he never left Canton. We knew that was very important. It's one more way to get a story out of a suspect, a subject, a defendant, and then use that as a piece of the puzzle. Because then once they make a statement, it's very hard to go back from that. I am an attorney also, as you know, and I would never let a client in any way, shape, or form take a polygraph or talk to law enforcement or anything else. I don't know why that occurred. I'm grateful it did, because that helped us put the puzzle together better to know that we were dealing with somebody who was lying to us and that knew more than they were letting on.
I understand why you would tell a client not to, but I think in the public's eyes, when someone declines to sit for a polygraph examination, the thought that they are guilty is what comes from that denial.
Yeah, but we were able to talk to Cutts a little bit, and we were able to nail down a story from him, which is good. We always want to get some story, even if it's a lie, so we have some base to work from. And he essentially told us that he had not left the Canton area, he'd been there, and he didn't know anything about what happened. So using other means, and I won't go into detail on what tools we used, but we were quickly able to determine that the story of Cutts staying in the Canton, Ohio area was a lie, that he actually had been moving around quite a bit. And then as we did interviews of more and more people, we realized that he had met with a former high school classmate of his, a woman named Maisha Farrell, and they'd actually been together the night that we had kind of nailed down. It was like June 15th, that we had nailed down that Jessie Davis had gone missing. So the fact that he was together with this other woman was odd to us, and we needed to explore that more. What the FBI also is really good at, as you know, Jerry, is we interview a lot of people. And as we interviewed more and more people, we started to focus on Maisha Farrell. So we went to talk to her. Our agents went to talk to her to find out why she was with Cutts, what they were doing, etc. She essentially denied any knowledge, and she lied to the agents. And as you know, you can't lie to the FBI. Actually, 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 makes it a federal offense to lie to an FBI agent, basically to interfere with their duty, and it causes them to write a false report. We knew Maisha was lying to us. We knew she was going to be in trouble. At this point, though, we still did not know where Jessie Davis was. As the days go on, you become more and more concerned because you want to find the person hopefully alive within the first couple days. And if you start going beyond that, you become extremely concerned that you're going to find a dead body and not the living person that we wanted to find. So we were really spending 24 hours a day over a week's time trying to find her, figure out what happened. we're gathering more and more evidence to make it look to us like Cutts was lying to us, which was not good for him. And we needed to know why. But again, he had a lawyer, which often makes it difficult for us to talk to the person and get the information, because any good lawyer will tell you that they'll tell their client not to talk to the FBI, especially. Some other background about Bobby Cutts that we also knew: there had been previous accusations about him abusing women. All these things were kind of pointing to him, that he had a violent past and he was tied somehow to this and not telling us the truth. As you know, over your career too, you just never can predict what these defendants are going to do or what calculus they're making. It certainly didn't help him that we were breaking down his friend Maisha, getting her to tell us what she knew and what had happened. As you know too, it's very difficult oftentimes if you don't have a body. The defendant could say, well, the person just took off to Mexico or something. It makes it very difficult. There are a lot of cases that the government does win and gets convictions for murder without a body, but it is really difficult. At that point, there are searchers. There was even a group, I remember it was a big deal. EquiSearch was there. They kind of go around the country and help out on events like this. And it was just a huge event with all the people we had. We, behind the scenes, were working to do as many interviews as we could. There's obviously some means that the FBI has to follow up on stories. I'm going to go by what is reported in the press on this with Bobby Cutts. Suffice it to say that we were in contact with the attorney quite a bit because, again, our number one thing was to find Jessie Davis and her baby alive. Even though we knew there were inconsistencies in his story and we knew about this odd behavior with Maisha Farrell, we still were appealing to the Cutts team. Hey, help us find her. If she's alive and hurt, we want to get her help, etc. Unbelievably, and this again is reported publicly and in the press, suffice it to say that Bobby Cutts was allowed to get into a car with two FBI agents from the Canton office and ride with them to show them where her body was located. If he didn't take us to the body, I don't know what would have happened. I do know for sure we would not have found Jessie Davis as quickly as we did, which still felt like a long time. It would have taken a long time. I mean, she was in the woods. It wasn't too far from a path, so eventually somebody would have happened on her remains and they would have been found, but I think it would have been quite some time before we would have known and had closure. Frankly, we were kind of lucky to have that happen, but we did make our own luck with our efforts, our technical efforts, our interviews, etc. To this day, I'm grateful that we were able to find her, but also a bit in disbelief that anybody would actually take us to where the body is and then not expect to be in some type of legal jeopardy. But regardless, in kind of this crazy story, this is what happened. A large part of it was just the fact that this went very fast, too. It was several days, but it just seemed to go very fast as well. And when it finally broke, it just like happened kind of out of the blue. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about how we did it or how we came about to this. But again, suffice it to say, he took us to where the body was. This is actually what was reported in the press in an open court. And it was just an absolutely horrific scene because she had been there a while. Her body was found about 35 miles north of Canton in a metro park near Cleveland. Now, also, if you talk about jurisdiction, her body was found in a county park, which actually sits within a national park itself. And I know from some of your other case studies that I've listened to that are all so intriguing and so interesting and shows the scope of all the cases the FBI can get into, where usually the FBI has jurisdiction if a murder occurs or bodies found in a national park. It's federal land, so the FBI has jurisdiction. Now, this one, I had an idea from our methods of collection, a general vicinity of where this body would be. And I thought for sure the body was going to be in the national park. It's just the way it looked. And then was surprised that it actually ended up in a county park within the federal park. I mean, the jurisdictional issues that we have to consider are just amazing. At that point, it's really a fait accompli. He's taken us to where her body is. She's deceased.
But how did that happen?
Because his lawyer let it happen. We'd polygraphed him. It was inconsistent. We were telling his attorney that we see these inconsistencies. We were telling him without telling him exactly how we knew that he was lying to us. We're breaking down Maisha Farrell, who finally did confess that she'd been with him and that she had taken cleaning supplies to him and helped him clean up the mess. And in fact, to tell you the whole thing, she had helped him move the body and the carpeting in his pickup truck and take it out of Canton to go dump it. So we knew all of this. And we were telling this to the attorney. And the attorney, he should not have had him talking to us at all. To this day, Jerry, I don't know why the attorney said he would take us to the body. Maybe it was Bobby had just felt guilt. Maybe there was that sense that he was a police officer and there was some kernel of goodness inside him that he wanted to make sure that the mother of his children was found. I don't know to this day.
Or maybe it was because he thought that the other girlfriend was going to talk to
That's
you and
possible
tell
too.
you.
And I still don't know whether he thought he was still going to try to just say something else happened. I'll talk about in a second what he said happened at trial, which to this day to me has made no sense at all, which kind of leads me to believe he was going to try to concoct some other story. But this just totally got away from him. He took us to the body, and I don't want to go into it. It was very graphic. And clearly her baby was viable and ready to be born within days, which led to kind of a novel criminal charge against him for the murder of the baby too, who had not yet been born. But because the baby was so close, they actually charged him with the murder. So that's where we're at there.
How did that happen, though, that he decided to take you there?
I never had a good answer to that. Maybe he was hoping he was going to get leniency if he took us there. It was weird because they said he would take us to the body but wouldn't admit anything. It's kind of like almost like, all right, government, you're going to have to be put to the task and be put to your proof, as the government always is in a criminal case. I was shocked when he actually went to trial. I thought for sure, like in that circumstance, you would eventually just work out a plea agreement with the prosecutors and ask for leniency because you actually helped resolve the case. You gave some closure to the families. You admit your remorse. But he took it to trial and they actually were seeking the death penalty on him, which again, maybe was going to be leveraged. But those types of questions would have to be between Bobby Cutts and his attorney. I don't know for sure.
Why don't we talk about the trial? Because even though the FBI participated in this investigation and did a lot of the major investigative work, but at the end, this is tried in state court. So talk about that.
When the FBI does assist in these matters and then the case is prosecuted, FBI agents can be fair game to provide testimony, which we did in this case. But yeah, it was a state prosecution for murder of both Jessie and the unborn child. I was surprised that he took it to trial, but we waited and watched, and Cutts did testify, and he described what happened. He said that he and Davis had fought in the apartment and he had thrown an elbow. He had just swung an elbow and hit her in the throat, and she dropped and was dead. Now, it doesn't take a longtime FBI agent to question that story. Because number one, it's very hard just to kill somebody with one shot like that. I am not very familiar with that happening. So that was suspicious. Second, he said he tried to resuscitate her and he couldn't do it. The question came up, well, why didn't you call 911? And he said he couldn't turn her phone on. None of this makes sense because she dies. You can't resuscitate her. You can't call 911. So what do? You wrap her up in a rug, throw her in a pickup truck with your friend, try to clean up the scene and drive the body 30, 35 miles north and throw her in the woods. None of that makes sense. This guy was on trial for capital murder, on trial for his life, and that was the best he could do. The jury saw through that and convicted him. The point is, though we weren't technically the lead on the case because we were assisting, personnel from Stark County and the FBI all testified to these matters as to what happened, and Cutts was convicted. He was convicted of both the murder of Davis and her unborn child.
And what about the girlfriend that assisted him in dumping the body?
Yeah, she took a plea. So she pled guilty to obstruction of justice for interfering with our investigation. And that's obviously a way that we can use leverage on people to get them to cooperate, where we can work with them on charges and what they would plead guilty to. She did about a year in prison, in fact, for what she did, and eventually got out.
At the end, what kind of time did he get? Did he get the death penalty?
So the jury decided to spare his life. When he did testify, he expressed remorse. He explained his efforts trying to revive her, and the jury spared his life. So he was given a sense of life in prison instead of the death penalty. He's eligible for parole in 57 years. He still has a long time to go. I always felt bad for Jessie Davis's mother, the mother and the son. Cutts had a few other children. We kind of ruined a number of families here. Jessie's mother, actually, in recent years, within the last, I want to say 6 or 7 years, has kind of forgiven Cutts, felt he did his time, and has kind of worked to get him out. And I think her main concern, I won't speak for her, this is conjecture on my part, from what I've read about her since, is that she definitely wanted her grandson to be able to see his father, even in prison, and probably to have some type of life with him. But I think that from what I've seen lately, the son has gotten to see his father in prison. And I don't know where that will go or how long. Knowing Ohio, I expect Cutts to continue to spend most of that 57 years in prison. So that's where he is.
Thank you for sharing that case review with us. I'm going to have in the show notes for this episode links to various newspaper articles and court documents that I found related to this. I know that eventually you worked more in public corruption. Let me ask my standard question, and then we'll talk just a little bit about the rest of your time in the Bureau and then what you're doing now. So, when and why did you join the FBI?
So ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to be an FBI agent. And I remember being very young, and the father of one of a fellow student of mine, even in grade school, he was an FBI agent, and he would come in and talk to the classes once in a while. And he had great stories about his work in the FBI. And I just thought it sounded exciting. It sounded like a job that you could really be doing the right thing. I think I had always been a rule follower and a law follower, and the work sounded really interesting. I started looking into it more and more, and I kind of set a path, even in high school, to get into the FBI. I read all the books I could, everything I could about the FBI, and I read up on Director Hoover, and I knew that he liked to hire a lot of accountants and lawyers as special agents. I didn't love math so much, and so the accounting thing probably wasn't going to be for me. But I thought, well, if I could get in, I could probably get in as a lawyer. I went through college, University of Akron, graduated, then went to the University of Akron School of Law, graduated, was in tremendous shape, ready to go to Quantico to be an FBI agent right when I was coming out of law school, and they had a hiring freeze, which often happens with the FBI. At that point, I had to pivot and figure out something else to do. As an attorney, I sat for the bar and I passed it, and I actually got a job as an enforcement attorney with the U.S. Federal Election Commission in Washington, D.C., and went there. I had a thought that if I at least got into the federal government, better shot at getting in the FBI. And little did I realize the Federal Election Commission, where I was hired as an enforcement attorney, was right across the street from FBI headquarters in downtown Washington. When I got there, I thought, well, this could be good. I'll probably bump into people who are in the FBI, get to know some folks as I'm here, and I'll learn a few things as an attorney along the way. That is exactly what happened. I spent 4 years with the FEC investigating campaign finance violations. Everybody who runs for federal office in this country has to form a committee and report all of its contributions and expenditures. I was handling a lot of high-profile cases as an attorney. It was really strange because by the mid-90s, the FBI was doing the criminal side of those investigations, often involving contributors at that time to several presidential candidates. And I started working with a bunch of FBI agents in the Washington area and kind of helping them and advising them on this really arcane area of the law, federal election law. And I was helping them with their investigations. And after about 4 years, I learned that the FBI was going to start hiring again because they were having a lot of retirements from the agent ranks. And so I talked to some of the agents I was working with. They thought it would be a great idea if I applied, and I did. And I got right in this time. I think some of it had to do with the fact I was already in the Washington area. I was already a federal employee, and I had this kind of niche expertise in election law that could benefit the Bureau, which is kind of what led me into the Bureau, into my whole corruption career with the Bureau, too.
And how many years did you work public corruption?
So overall total, I would say about 10 years, at least half of my career. I retired from the FBI in 2018. I did almost 23 years as an agent. I worked corruption matters in Washington Field. I was assigned to Washington Field office when I first got out, was on the Federal Corruption Squad. So that was 4 years. And I worked a number of high profile, very interesting cases there. My wife and I wanted to get closer to home in Ohio, and the Bureau offers you one time a career, your office of choice. We called it an OP, as you know, or office of preference. And I had put myself on the list for Youngstown, Ohio, and thinking, well, maybe I'll get offered a chance to go to Youngstown in 15 years or so. And I went on the list, and within 6 months, they called me and offered me a position in Youngstown, Ohio. I jumped at it and didn't quite realize why nobody wanted to go to Youngstown, Ohio, until my wife and I were driving there, and I realized kind of what I was getting myself into.
All right. So wait a minute. Before you move on, what was the issue with Youngstown, Ohio?
Well, again, always remembering life events, I realized as I was driving my wife and I and our small infant baby into Youngstown late at night one night after we had moved from Washington, I was excited to be in Northeast Ohio because we still had family here and to be close to them. And I knew the work in Youngstown was good because I've been talking to other agents about it. But as I drove up, it must have been my dad who was deceased. He must have been reaching out to me. My dad was a truck driver, and for 20 years, he drove the route from Akron to Youngstown to do deliveries, and he never once took us to Youngstown. And I was like, and my dad was a very practical guy, and I was like struck kind of like, uh-oh, I wonder why he never took us to Youngstown. And I very quickly learned about Youngstown. Now, there are great people there. I will not speak ill of them, but the crime and corruption and organized crime in Youngstown is well known. They literally write books and do shows about it. I learned really quickly about the violent crime, organized crime arena. And then I worked a lot of public corruption in Youngstown while I was there. For about 5 years, I did that.
I did a case review with Joe Bushner, episode 195, which was a bribery and corruption case against Congressman James Traficant. Were you involved in that?
In fact, I was, yes. And I guess technically I was the lead case agent on Traficant. Joe Bushner, great agent, great friend. We worked together on that case every day. The Youngstown RA was not huge, so pretty much every agent in the office worked together on that case. And yeah, we investigated that case for about 3 years on a sitting U.S. congressman, which again, real quick, as a side note, Traficant has been in the news a lot the last few days because he was only the second U.S. congressman since the Civil War to be expelled because we had investigated him and got him convicted for corruption. He was expelled, and then obviously that is related to Congressman George Santos, who was just expelled from the House as well. So we were hearing Traficant's name a lot.
Well, if anybody wants to listen to that case, which you played a major role in, again, it's episode 195.
Excellent. And it was a great podcast as well. I did hear it. It was great. Then I was the unit chief of the public corruption unit at FBI headquarters. Actually, I was the acting section chief for a time over corruption and civil rights. Did that for a couple years. And then kind of moved over to the organized crime drug enforcement arena.
You eventually retired from the FBI. When did you retire and what are you doing now?
In my last several years in the FBI, I was working with the organized crime drug enforcement task forces. And the last couple of years, I was actually working directly every day with Main Justice in Washington on transnational organized crime and worked a lot on information sharing between law enforcement agencies. So I retired in 2018 and kind of moved into the business world. I worked for a company for a while, and then I did background investigations, as many of us do. I eventually landed with a company called A1C Partners. We're a small service disabled veteran-owned business. We do intelligence work with the government now, definitely on the criminal side. I'm a director in that company, and we provide mostly open source research work to the federal government. And I also am an adjunct faculty member at George Mason. I teach intelligence studies and also a course in government corruption. I've written 2 textbooks, one on intelligence and one on government corruption, published by Cognella. Also, I have my own law firm. In many ways, I feel like I'm busier than I ever have been in my life, but it is good to be able to work a whole career with the Bureau and then move on to other things. My law firm is Denholm Law, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. and Ohio, and do a number of things through it.
I get comments from people who listen to this podcast all the time about whether or not FBI agents really know the meaning of the word retired.
That's right. That's right.
I am going to put a link to your textbook. Is it something that the public would want to read?
I hope so, and they certainly can. It is a textbook, and I use that at the university. But I've had a number of agents who are always very supportive. That is a great thing with the FBI group. Everybody's really supportive of each other, and several have said, hey, I want to buy your book. Actually, you can find both of them on Amazon as well. Frankly, they are a little more on the textbook side. I know you write great fiction books about the FBI, so it just depends on what people's flavor is in that.
We've come to the part of the interview where I like to give my guest the last word. So, what would you like to say?
One thing that came to my mind is, and congratulations again on your 300th podcast. And I listened to your interview of Director Ray and thought it was great. Both you and Director Ray, I think, were spot on about many things. I really wanted to say like a couple things, not that the director needs backed up on anything, but it really occurred to me two things when you were asking him questions about kind of the current state of affairs with the public's view of the FBI and just all the politics involved and the way things are going nowadays in this country. Two things as far as whether people trust the FBI. And you hear a lot of politicians right now saying some really very beyond outlandish things about the FBI, which I completely discount. I really had the thought, two things. One is that trust in the FBI. Yeah, I think the American public still very much trusts the FBI. And here's why I know this. If you are a teller in a bank or a bank manager and your bank gets robbed or you're defrauded by some scammer from some other part of the country or the world, or you're in some other way harmed or your child is kidnapped, who do Americans call? They call the FBI, and the FBI goes and they help them. They help Americans. That's always going to be true. And I know it's true now. They don't call their congressman. I'm sorry, that's just not the case. They don't call their city council when those things happen. So yeah, they trust the FBI. The second thing, I heard the director talk a lot about recruitment levels. I know that's true because I told you I teach at George Mason University, and my classes are loaded with people who want to work for the FBI. These are all young, super great people, very high intellects, and they take my class because, one, they really think it's cool to hear from an FBI agent who's a faculty member there. They think they have a lot to learn from me, which I hope is true. And they all, to a person, ask me about strategies about getting into the FBI. So to me, that is not a discredited agency. That is an agency very much still on the upswing. I really want to thank you for publicizing this. I know most of my retired colleagues are still, as I am, very proud to be in the FBI and proud of our association and look for ways always for that to continue. So thank you for your efforts on that, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com where you'll find a headshot for Rich Denholm, links to articles about this murder investigation, including court documents of Bobby Cutts' appeal and case-related photos of Jessie Davis and Bobby Cutts. There's also a link to Investigating and Prosecuting Corruption, an anthology, one of Rich's textbooks, which I've also included in my FBI reading resource, my colorful list of books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. If you are interested in listening to another case involving the investigation of another man suspected of murdering his girlfriend, check out the link to FBI Retired Case File Review episode 098 about the Thomas Capano and Marie Fahey murder case. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.